There are friendships that the world sees, and then there are the ones that live in the quiet spaces between public appearances, in whispered conversations, in shared tears, in laughter that no photographer ever captured. The friendship between Elton John and Princess Diana was both. The world saw the glamour, the charity galas, the elegant smiles exchanged across crowded rooms. But what the world never fully understood was the depth of what existed beneath all of that, the raw, unfiltered bond between two people who found in each other something they could not find anywhere else, the freedom to be completely, honestly human. For nearly 3 decades, Elton John has carried the weight of memories that most people will never truly understand. He has spoken in fragments, offered glimpses in interviews, and poured some of his grief into his music. But now, years after the world lost Diana, Elton has begun to open the vault. Slowly, carefully, and with the kind of emotional courage that mirrors the very qualities he so admired in the woman he called one of his closest friends. What is revealed is not simply a story about a pop star and a princess. It is a story about loneliness, about courage, about the terrible cost of pride, and about the kind of love that does not need romance to be profound. To understand the friendship, you have to understand the world both of them were living in when they first crossed paths. It was 1981, and Britain was intoxicated by the idea of a fairy tale. A young, luminous woman named Diana Spencer was about to marry Prince Charles and step into the most scrutinized role in the world. The press was enchanted. The public was enchanted. And on the surface, everything looked golden. But Elton John, who had already spent years navigating the brutal machinery of fame, knew better than most that golden surfaces often conceal fractures. He had been around royalty before, performing for the Queen Mother, attending intimate gatherings hosted by Princess Margaret at Kensington Palace, exchanging witty remarks at events populated by lords and dukes. He had learned to play the game of those circles with a kind of graceful performance. Yet he had never truly felt that he belonged there. There was always a layer of formality, a wall of expectation, that kept genuine human connection just out of reach. That changed at a birthday celebration inside Windsor Castle in the summer of 1981. The room was everything you would expect. Chandeliers, jewelry, impeccably dressed guests maintaining the careful posture of people who have been trained since childhood never to appear too eager, too warm, or too real. Elton sat at the piano, playing softly, feeling, by his own later admission, genuinely out of place. And then Diana walked in. She had not yet been crowned anything. She was weeks away from a wedding that would transform her life entirely. But even then, before the titles and the tiaras and the global adoration, there was something about her that cut straight through the artificiality of the room. Elton noticed it immediately. She moved through that ballroom with a naturalness that seemed almost defiant given the setting. When their eyes met, there was no performance in her smile. It was simply warm, simply real, simply her. Within minutes, they were talking. Not the careful, measured conversation of people trying to impress one another, but the effortless kind that happens when two people immediately recognize something of themselves in the other. They laughed together about the stiffness of the evening. And then, in a moment that neither of them had planned, they found themselves dancing the Charleston together in the middle of the ballroom floor. Spontaneous, ridiculous, joyful. Even the Queen, it was said, smiled at the sight of it. For Elton, that moment crystallized something important. This was not a princess performing charm. This was a human being who was genuinely, wonderfully alive. What grew out of that evening was not the casual acquaintance of two famous people who occasionally appeared at the same events. It was a friendship rooted in something far more honest, a mutual recognition of pain. Elton has spoken candidly in recent years about the reality of his life during that period. Behind the sequins, the platform shoes, and the spectacular concerts that filled arenas around the world, he was struggling. Addiction had its hooks in him. Self-doubt gnawed at him. The constant scrutiny of his sexuality in a world that had not yet learned to simply accept him for who he was left invisible bruises that no amount of applause could heal. Diana's pain, though different in its particulars, came from a similar place. The experience of being watched constantly, of being expected to perform a version of yourself that satisfies everyone else's needs while your own needs go quietly, systematically unmet. As the 1980s wore on and her marriage to Prince Charles became a source of private misery rather than the fairy tale the world had been sold, she found that most people around her had an agenda. Friends who were really informants, advisors who were really gatekeepers, family who expected her to simply endure. With Elton, there were no agendas. He has described their private time together as a rare sanctuary, hours spent simply talking, listening, being present for one another without the performance that both of their lives demanded everywhere else. He would visit her, or she would call him, and for a little while the crushing weight of their respective public lives would lift just slightly. He understood loneliness disguised as celebrity. She understood the prison that can be built from privilege and expectation. They were, in ways that mattered enormously, mirrors for each other. Their friendship was also expressed in the causes they championed together. By the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, AIDS had become one of the defining humanitarian crises of a generation, and it carried with it a stigma so vicious and so deeply ignorant that even governments were slow to respond. For the gay community especially, it was a time of profound terror and grief. Elton, who had lost friends to the disease and understood personally the community it was devastating, threw himself into advocacy and awareness work with an intensity that spoke to genuine anguish, not merely celebrity obligation. Diana's involvement in that advocacy remains one of the most significant and courageous chapters of her public life. At a time when public fear and misinformation about AIDS transmission was at its most damaging peak, she walked into hospital wards, sat beside patients, and took their hands, bare hands without gloves, in full view of the cameras, and looked them in the eyes with complete dignity and compassion that they deserved and that most of the world was still too frightened to offer them. Elton has said repeatedly that this single act, replicated in different forms throughout her advocacy work, did more to shift public perception than almost any public information campaign could have achieved. She made a human because she was entirely, unguardedly human herself. He admired her for that fearlessness in a way that went beyond ordinary admiration. To Elton, it was evidence of the same quality he had glimpsed on that dance floor in 1981, an absolute refusal at her core to let fear or social pressure override her sense of what was right and what was kind. The friendship had its lighter dimensions too, and Elton has always been careful to preserve those memories because they say something important about who Diana really was beneath the iconic imagery. She was funny, genuinely, mischievously, brilliantly funny. She loved gossip, the harmless, affectionate kind that comes from someone who is endlessly fascinated by people and the ridiculous situations that human beings find themselves in. She teased Elton mercilessly about his wardrobe, which, given the spectacular extremity of some of his choices during those years, was, admittedly, a target-rich environment. Elton has recalled gatherings where she would dissolve into helpless laughter at his jokes, or exchange knowing glances with him across crowded rooms when some particularly pompous aristocrat said something especially self-important. There was a private language between them, the shorthand of close friendship, built from years of shared experience and mutual observation. He loved that she could be in a room full of the most powerful, famous, intimidating people on earth and quietly find the absurdity in all of it. One particular evening that Elton has recounted with obvious delight involved a private dinner party where both Richard Gere and Sylvester Stallone were among the guests. Both men, by Elton's account, became entirely captivated by Diana's presence, and the resulting competition for her attention escalated to a degree that struck Elton as simultaneously mortifying and hilarious. He wrote in his memoir that she had the extraordinary ability to render even Hollywood royalty slightly ridiculous in her presence, not through any effort or manipulation on her part, but simply because she was so entirely and irresistibly herself. But even within the warmth and laughter of that friendship, the mid-1990s brought a rupture that Elton has only in recent years felt fully ready to discuss with honesty. By 1996, both of their lives were under enormous strain. Elton was working on a charity project, a photography book featuring images from the world of rock and roll, with all proceeds designated for AIDS research and support. He had asked Diana to write the foreword, and she had agreed. For him, it was more than a contribution to a book. It was a continuation of the advocacy they had both invested themselves in, a further statement of solidarity and compassion in an area that remained deeply important to both of them. When her withdrawal came, communicated through a formal letter from her office rather than a personal conversation, The explanation offered was that royal advisors had objected to her association with a publication that included photographs they considered inappropriate for a senior royal to be connected with. Elton understood the institutional context. He knew how the palace operated, how advice could become instruction, and instruction could become command. But understanding the context did not remove the sting of what felt, in that moment, like abandonment. He sent her a message expressing his hurt. She responded with what he later described as a sharp, cold letter that left no space for reconciliation. And then there was silence. Heavy, prolonged, and painful for both of them, though neither was quite ready to be the one to end it. He has admitted since that he could have picked up the phone. He has said plainly that pride was a factor on his side, not just hers. They were both, in his words, too proud, and they both paid the price of that pride in months of unnecessary distance. Diana, meanwhile, was navigating perhaps the most personally destabilizing period of her life. Her divorce from Prince Charles had been finalized in August of 1996. She had been stripped of the title Her Royal Highness, a symbolic diminishment that carried real weight about how the institution regarded her. She was rebuilding her identity, her independence, and her sense of purpose largely on her own, surrounded by people whose loyalties she had good reason to question. The silence between her and Elton was not the only wound she was carrying. The reconciliation, when it finally came, arrived with the terrible weight of shared grief. In July of 1997, Gianni Versace, the brilliant Italian designer who had been a genuine friend to both Elton and Diana, was murdered outside his Miami home. The shock of his death reverberated through every corner of the fashion, entertainment, and celebrity world. But for those who had known him personally, it was something rawer and more irreplaceable than shock. It was the loss of someone who had seen them, understood them, and genuinely loved them. At Versace's funeral in Milan, Diana and Elton found themselves in the same room for the first time since their falling out. She made her way to where he was sitting, reached for his hand, and said what needed to be said, that the argument had been foolish, that she was sorry, that she wanted her friend back. And then, with the timing and the instinct that defined her at her most essentially herself, she made him laugh. The details of what she said in that moment Elton has shared with a warmth that makes clear it remains one of his most treasured memories of her. That uniquely Diana combination of sincere emotion and irrepressible humor that was entirely her own. Their friendship was restored in an instant, with plans made to meet again, to properly catch up, to begin the next chapter of a bond that had survived disagreement and distance and grief. Elton has said that leaving that funeral, despite the sadness of the occasion, he felt something that had been missing for almost a year clicked back into place. 6 weeks later, in the early hours of August 31st, 1997, Elton John was woken by the sound of his fax machine. He would later describe the surreal confusion of those first moments, the struggle toward wakefulness, the bewilderment at a message of condolence arriving in the middle of the night before he understood what had happened. He turned on the television, and the world, for him, simply stopped. Diana had been killed in a car crash in Paris. She was 36 years old. The meeting they had planned would never happen. The next chapter of the friendship would never be written. The grief that followed was, by Elton's own account, unlike anything he had experienced before or since. He has described it as grief layered with guilt, the particular anguish of someone who knows that months of the time they had with someone they loved were wasted on silence and pride. He has been unflinchingly honest about this. He did not try to rewrite history in the aftermath of her death or pretend that their friendship had been seamless. He acknowledged the rift, acknowledged his own role in sustaining it, and carried the weight of that honesty. When he stood at Westminster Abbey and sang a rewritten version of Candle in the Wind for an audience of millions who were watching around the world, he was not simply performing a tribute. He was saying goodbye to his friend, to the woman who had danced at Charleston with him in a Windsor ballroom, who had made him laugh when laughter seemed impossible, who had held the hands of dying men when the world looked away, who had whispered reconciliation over shared grief in a church in Milan, and who had been taken from the world before any of the plans they had made together could be fulfilled. What Elton John has finally confessed, in the years since, and what his gradual openness about this friendship ultimately reveals, is something more profound than celebrity memoir. It is a testimony to the rarity and the preciousness of genuine human connection, and to particular cruelty of time. He has said that he wishes he had called her during those months of silence. He has said that pride is a foolish thing to let stand between people who truly matter to each other. He has said that the memory of her makes him want to be braver, kinder, and more willing to be the first one to reach out. Diana, in the way Elton describes her, was someone who understood intuitively something that most people spend entire lifetimes trying to learn, that the truest form of greatness is simply the willingness to see another person fully and love them for exactly what they are. She did that for him. He did that for her. And in the end, that is the truth at the center of everything Elton John has finally been ready to say. The world knew the princess. He knew the person, and he carries her with him still.